Please, let me and my child stay the night." Ivy Coleridge stood in the doorway, snow melting off her shawl, her daughter trembling against her hip. Silas Pruitt said nothing at first. He simply looked past her, at the empty road behind them, at the child's blue lips, at the storm rolling in fast from the ridge. He knew that door had been closed to strangers for 3 winters straight. He opened it anyway. What he didn't know was that the woman on his porch owned a dying farm 2 miles east, cracked soil, a collapsed barn, and a debt that would swallow it whole before spring. And what Ivy didn't know was that the quiet rancher who gave her a bed by the fire that night would become the only reason her land and her daughter survived the season. By winter, everything between them would change. But it started with one door, one storm, and one impossible request. If this story pulls you in, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens between Ivy and Silas by winter's end will stay with you long after this video ends. The knock came just after dark, 3 soft raps against a door that hadn't opened for a stranger in 3 winters. Silas Pruitt set down his coffee and listened again, half convinced the wind was playing tricks on him the way it often did on nights like this, when the temperature dropped fast and the world outside turned to ice and silence. But the knock came a second time, weaker now, and something in it made him rise from his chair before he'd even decided to. When he pulled the door open, he found a woman swaying on his porch, snow crusted along her shawl, and a small girl pressed so tightly against her hip that at first, Silas thought the child was part of the woman's coat. "Please," the woman said, her voice cracking on the single word. "Let me and my child stay the night." Silas said nothing. He looked past her toward the road, empty and already vanishing beneath the drifting snow. Then back at the girl's lips, faintly blue, her small body shaking in a rhythm that had nothing to do with cold alone. He knew what that kind of trembling meant. He'd seen it before, on a night he tried hard never to think about. Her name was Ivy Coleridge, though she didn't offer it until she was seated by his fire. Her daughter Nora, wrapped in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of horse and cedar. Silas heated milk without being asked, set a plate of cold biscuits on the table, and pulled a second chair close to the flames before either of them had spoken more than a few words. Ivy watched him work with the wary eyes of someone who had learned the hard way that kindness rarely came without a price attached. She kept one arm around Nora even as the girl's shivering eased, even as the color slowly returned to her small face, because trust was not something Ivy gave freely anymore. Silas noticed the way her eyes moved, toward the door, toward the window, toward the darkness beyond it, as though she expected something to follow her out of that storm. He didn't ask. Not yet. He simply banked the fire higher and told her, in a voice too quiet for questions, that she was safe until morning. What neither of them said, what neither of them yet understood, was that morning would not be the end of anything. It would only be the beginning. Ivy woke before dawn out of habit, the way she always did now, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. For a moment she forgot where she was, and the unfamiliar ceiling above her sent a jolt of panic through her chest until she remembered the knock, the door, the stranger who hadn't asked for a single thing in return. She found Silas already outside, breaking ice from the water trough with the kind of steady, practiced motion that told her this was a man used to working alone, used to solving problems with his own 2 hands, because there had been no one else to share the weight. When she stepped onto the porch, he glanced up just long enough to nod, then went back to his work as if her presence required no explanation. It was Nora who broke the silence, tugging at her mother's sleeve and pointing toward the barn, where a thin trail of smoke curled from a chimney pipe Ivy hadn't noticed the night before. "Is that yours too?" the girl asked, and Silas answered before Ivy could stop her daughter from prying. "Used to keep hands there," he said. "Empty now." Something passed behind his eyes when he said it, something old and unhealed, and Ivy recognized it instantly because she carried the same thing herself, buried just as deep. She hadn't meant to tell him about the farm. She'd meant to eat a quiet breakfast, thank him for his mercy, and disappear back down the road before the sun rose high enough to reveal exactly how little she had left to return to. But when Silas asked, plainly and without judgment, where she and Nora had been walking to in a storm like that, the truth came out before she could stop it. 2 miles east, she told him. A farm that had belonged to her husband before a fever took him 18 months ago, leaving her with cracked fields, a barn roof half caved in from last spring's hail, and a debt to the bank that grew heavier every season she couldn't plant. She hadn't been walking toward shelter that night. She'd been walking away from a letter that arrived that morning, one that gave her until the first thaw to pay what she owed or lose the only thing her daughter had left of her father. Silas listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at certain details, loosening at others, and when Ivy finally fell silent, waiting for the pity she'd grown so tired of receiving, he said only one thing. 18 months is a long time to carry a roof by yourself. It wasn't sympathy in his voice, it was recognition. And that frightened Ivy more than his silence had. She left that afternoon, thanking him twice at the door, insisting she and Nora could manage the walk back before dark. Silas didn't argue, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he wanted to. He simply packed a sack with bread, dried meat, and a small tin of salve for Nora's chapped hands, and pressed it into Ivy's arms before she could refuse it. It wasn't until she was halfway down the frozen road, Nora's small hand tucked inside her own, that Ivy realized he had never once asked what she planned to do about the debt, never offered advice she hadn't requested, never made her feel smaller for needing help in the first place. That absence of judgment sat strangely in her chest, warm in a place that had gone cold months ago. She told herself it meant nothing. Kindness like that rarely lasted past a single night, and she had learned not to build hope on things that vanished by morning. But 3 days later, when Ivy stepped outside to face what remained of her barn, she found Silas Pruitt already there, standing in the wreckage of her collapsed roof with a coil of rope over one shoulder and an expression that dared her to send him away. Ivy stood frozen at the top of the porch steps, one hand still gripping the doorframe, staring at the man who had no business standing in the ruins of her barn. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than she intended. Silas didn't look up right away. He was studying the collapsed beam overhead, running a hand along the splintered wood the way a doctor might examine a wound before deciding whether it could be saved. "Wasn't planning to stay," he said finally. "Just came to look." But the rope over his shoulder said otherwise, and so did the wagon parked at the edge of her field, loaded with lumber she hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to pay him back for. Ivy felt something tighten in her chest, somewhere between gratitude and suspicion, because in her experience, men who showed up uninvited rarely left without taking something in return. "I don't have money for this," she said plainly, wanting the truth out in the open before either of them pretended otherwise. Silas finally turned to face her, and there was no pity in his expression, only a kind of quiet stubbornness she was beginning to recognize. "Didn't ask for any." He worked through the morning without asking permission for anything else, hauling fallen beams clear of the wreckage while Ivy watched from the doorway, torn between telling him to leave and admitting, somewhere beneath her pride, that she had no idea how she'd have managed the barn alone. Nora settled the question for her, wandering out in her boots to hand Silas nails one at a time, as though she'd appointed herself his assistant, and something about the sight of her daughter laughing at his dry, clipped jokes softened whatever resistance Ivy had left. By midday, Ivy found herself boiling coffee she couldn't spare, setting a cup on the fence post beside him without a word, and Silas accepted it with a nod that said more than any thanks could have. It was Nora who finally asked the question hanging in the air since the first knock on his door. "Why are you helping us?" Silas paused, hammer resting against his palm, and for a long moment Ivy thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Because somebody should have helped me once," he said, and didn't. The words landed heavier than he seemed to intend, and he went back to work before either of them could ask what he meant by them. She learned the rest of it 2 days later, not from Silas himself, but from old Mrs. Abernathy at the general store. who lowered her voice the way people do when they think they're being discreet about gossip they're eager to share. Silas Pruitt had lost his wife and infant son 6 winters back, to a fever that swept through during a storm, not unlike the one that had brought Ivy to his door. He'd ridden for the doctor himself, she said, through snow that should have killed him too, and by the time he returned with help, it was already too late for either of them. Since then, folks said, he kept to himself, worked his land alone, and turned away anyone who came asking for charity, as though helping strangers might undo whatever guilt he carried from the one night he couldn't. Ivy walked home with that story sitting heavy in her chest, and it changed the way she looked at him the next time his wagon appeared at the edge of her field. Not as a stranger with nothing better to do, but as a man trying, in his own quiet way, to settle a debt no one had ever asked him to pay. The barn roof took 11 days to rebuild, and somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them quite noticing the shift, Silas stopped leaving before dark. He'd stay for supper, simple as it was, and afterward he'd sit by the fire while Nora read aloud from the one battered storybook Ivy had managed to keep through every hardship, stumbling over words she was still learning while Silas listened with more patience than Ivy had ever seen a grown man offer a child who wasn't his own. It was during one of those evenings, with the fire low and Nora already asleep against his arm, that Ivy finally asked him the question she'd been circling for days. Why us? Why this farm? Out of every family in the valley who might need help? Silas was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual steadiness. Because the night you knocked on my door, I almost didn't open it. He admitted that some part of him had wanted to pretend he hadn't heard, to let the storm pass and the road stay empty, because opening that door meant risking the kind of loss he'd sworn never to feel again. But I opened it anyway, he said, and I've been trying to figure out ever since whether that was mercy or something else. Ivy didn't have an answer for him that night, but the question stayed with her long after he'd gone, turning over in her mind while she lay awake listening to Nora's steady breathing beside her. She thought of the letter still tucked beneath her mattress, the debt that grew heavier with each passing week, regardless of how many beams Silas nailed back into place, and she wondered how much longer his kindness could hold against a problem that money alone could solve. It was a fear she hadn't voiced to him, partly out of pride, and partly because some quiet part of her worried that admitting the full truth of her situation might finally be the thing that drove him away, the way everything good in her life seemed eventually to do. She told herself she would manage it alone, the way she had managed everything since her husband died. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't entirely true anymore. Somewhere in the last 11 days, she had stopped bracing herself for Silas to leave and started bracing instead for the day the bank's letter would force her hand before winter even had the chance to finish what it started. That day came sooner than she expected. Ivy was hanging wash on the line when she heard hooves on the frozen road, too fast and too sharp to belong to Silas's steady mare, and when she turned, she found a man in a dark coat dismounting at her gate with a folded paper in his gloved hand and an expression that told her exactly what kind of news he'd come to deliver. If you believe people deserve a second chance before you judge their story, drop a comment below saying, "Never judge." Because what Ivy is about to face will test everything she and Silas have built in just 11 days. The man at the gate introduced himself as Everett Slade, a debt collector working on behalf of the Cinderwood Trust Bank, and he delivered his words with the practiced calm of someone who had ruined a great many families and learned not to let it show on his face. "Mrs. Coleridge," he said, glancing at the paper in his hand rather than at her, "the bank has extended your grace period twice already. There won't be a third extension." Ivy felt the cold reach past her coat and settle somewhere deeper, somewhere that had nothing to do with the weather. She asked how long she had, and Slade's answer came without hesitation, as though he'd rehearsed it on the ride over. 3 weeks. If the debt wasn't settled in full by then, the farm would be seized and sold at auction, and she and Nora would have nowhere left to call their own. He tipped his hat before riding off, the same courteous gesture he probably offered every family he was about to destroy, and Ivy stood at the gate long after he disappeared down the road, the folded paper trembling in her hand. She didn't tell Silas that evening. She told herself it was because she didn't want to ruin the quiet he'd built back into her house, the sound of Nora's laughter over supper, the easy way he'd started fixing things around the farm without being asked, as though he intended to stay through more than just the winter. But the truth, if she was honest with herself, was closer to shame. She had let herself lean on him these past weeks, had let herself imagine, in small foolish moments, that maybe things could stay this way. Admitting the debt out loud felt like admitting she had nothing to offer him but a problem too large for either of them to fix, and some hardened part of her still expected that once he understood the size of it, he'd do what every practical man before him had done and quietly disappear. So she said nothing and smiled through supper, and hoped the fear in her chest didn't show as clearly on her face as it felt. It was Nora who gave it away. 3 days later, asking Silas over breakfast in the innocent way children ask the questions adults spend their lives avoiding. "Are we going to have to leave, like Papa did?" Silas set down his fork slowly, and Ivy felt her stomach drop as he turned toward her, waiting. There was no point denying it once the words were out in the open, so she told him everything. The letter, the 3 weeks, the sum of money that might as well have been the moon for all her chances of gathering it in time. She braced herself for his silence, for the careful retreat she'd seen in other men's eyes the moment a woman's troubles became too heavy to carry alongside their own. Instead, Silas asked one question, quiet but immovable. "How much?" When she told him, he didn't flinch, though the number was more than most ranchers in the valley cleared in 2 full seasons. He simply nodded once, the way he did when he'd already decided something and saw no use discussing it further, and said, "Then we've got 3 weeks to make this farm worth more than that debt." What followed was unlike anything Ivy had expected from a man who kept so much of himself locked away. Silas rode into town before sunrise and returned with 2 hired hands he'd apparently convinced to work on credit, promising them payment once the spring cattle sold. He walked every acre of her land with a surveyor's eye, marking which fields could still be salvaged before the ground froze solid, which fences needed mending before livestock could graze there again, which parts of the barn could be finished in time to shelter animals through what remained of the season. Ivy followed him from field to field, half in awe and half in disbelief, because no one had looked at her farm this way since her husband died, not as a burden to be managed, but as something worth saving. When she asked him, breathless from trying to keep pace with his long strides, why he was pouring so much of himself into land that wasn't his, Silas stopped walking long enough to look at her directly. "Because I watched a farm die once already," he said. "I'm not doing it again if I can help it." It was the closest he'd come to speaking his late wife's name since Mrs. Abernathy had first told Ivy the story, and Ivy understood in that moment that this was no longer only about her debt. The work moved fast after that, faster than Ivy thought possible, though the strain of it showed plainly on Silas by the end of each day. He was pushing himself harder than his own farm ever seemed to demand, rising before dawn to tend his own animals before riding straight to hers, working until the light failed and sometimes past it, by lantern, in cold that turned breath to fog and fingers to stiff, clumsy things barely able to hold a hammer. Ivy tried more than once to tell him to slow down, that she couldn't ask this of him, that whatever debt of guilt he carried from his own past didn't need to be repaid through her survival. Silas brushed the concern aside every time, insisting he was fine, that the work needed doing, and there was no sense waiting for warmer weather that wouldn't come soon enough to matter. But Ivy noticed the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching, the way he pressed a palm briefly to his side after lifting anything heavy, small signs she recognized, because she'd watched her own husband ignore his body's warnings right up until the fever that took him. 2 weeks into the 3, with the barn nearly finished and half the fields cleared for spring planting, Silas collapsed in the field without warning, dropping to one knee in the frozen mud before Ivy could reach him. She ran the distance between them faster than she thought her legs could carry her, catching him just before he went down completely, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the biting cold around them. "Silas," she said, gripping his shoulders, trying to keep the panic out of her voice for Nora's sake, though the girl was already crying somewhere behind her. He tried to wave her off, tried to insist it was nothing, just the cold catching up with him, but his breathing came shallow and uneven, and when Ivy pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat radiating off his skin told her everything his stubborn pride refused to admit. It was the same fever. She was certain of it the instant she felt it. The same relentless burn that had taken her husband in a matter of days. And as she half-carried, half-dragged Silas toward the house with Nora sobbing at her side, one single terrifying thought consumed everything else in her mind. She could not lose him the same way she'd lost everything else. Not now. Not when she had only just begun to let herself believe that this time staying might actually be worth the risk. Ivy got him inside before the worst of the shaking set in, laying him near the fire and stripping away his frozen coat with hands that wouldn't stop trembling themselves. Nora hovered in the doorway, too frightened to come closer, too frightened to look away, and Ivy forced herself to speak calmly for her daughter's sake, even as her own mind spun through every terrible memory of the last fever that had taken someone she loved. She sent Nora running for the Hendricks place, the nearest neighbors with a horse fast enough to reach town before dark, with instructions to fetch Dr. Whitfield no matter the cost, no matter what it took. Then she was alone with Silas, boiling water she didn't know what to do with, pressing cool cloths to skin that burned hotter with each passing hour, and talking to him in a low, steady voice even though his eyes had gone glassy and unfocused because silence felt like giving up, and she refused to give up before the doctor even arrived. The hours between Nora leaving and the doctor's arrival stretched longer than any Ivy had lived through since her husband's final days, and somewhere in the middle of them, gripping Silas's hand while his fever climbed, she said things out loud she'd never planned to say to him at all. She told him about the nights after her husband died when she'd sat in this same chair, certain the farm and everything on it would eventually crush her, certain she'd raise Nora alone with nothing but debt and cold fields to pass down to her. She told him that his knock-turned kindness that first snowy night hadn't just saved them from the storm, it had reminded her that mercy still existed in the world, that not every door closed when a stranger needed shelter. And somewhere past midnight, with his hand limp in hers and his breathing shallow, she finally admitted the thing she'd been circling for weeks without letting herself say it plainly. "I don't want you to just fix my barn, Silas," she whispered. "I want you to stay. Not because you owe anyone anything, because I choose you." He didn't answer. He couldn't. But she said it anyway, into the fire-lit dark, because some truths needed saying whether or not anyone was awake to hear them. Dr. Whitfield arrived a little before dawn, his coat still dusted with snow, his bag already open before he'd fully crossed the threshold. He worked over Silas with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen this fever before and knew exactly how much time it could steal if given the chance, checking his pulse, his breathing, the heat radiating from his skin, asking Ivy short, pointed questions about how long the fever had lasted and how it had started. When he finally sat back on his heels, his expression gave nothing away, and Ivy felt her heart stop entirely while she waited for him to speak. "He's strong," the doctor said finally. "And he was found early. That matters more than anything." He explained that the next day would tell them everything, that fevers like this one broke or worsened within a matter of hours, and that all Ivy could do now was keep him warm, keep him hydrated, and wait. It was not the certainty she had hoped for, but it was more hope than she'd been given the last time she sat beside a bed like this one, and she clung to it the way a drowning woman clings to anything solid. The day that followed was the longest of Ivy's life, longer even than the night Slade had ridden up her drive with news that could have ended everything. She didn't leave Silas's side except to check on Nora, who had taken up a silent vigil of her own by the window, watching the road as though willpower alone could hurry the doctor's return visit. Ivy changed the cloths on Silas's forehead every few minutes, whispered to him though she had no way of knowing if the words reached him at all, and prayed in the quiet, wordless way of someone who had stopped believing prayers were answered, but couldn't stop offering them anyway. By late afternoon, something shifted. His breathing evened out, slow and deep instead of shallow and ragged, and when Ivy pressed her hand to his forehead again, the fire beneath his skin had finally begun to cool. His eyes opened just after sunset, unfocused at first, then slowly finding her face in the firelight, and the first word out of his mouth wasn't a question about the fever or the farm or how long he'd been unconscious. It was her name. He recovered slowly over the following days, too weak at first to do more than sit propped against the pillows while Nora read to him from her battered storybook, insisting he needed the company even though the doctor had prescribed rest above all else. Ivy tended him with a quiet devotion that surprised even herself, and somewhere in those long, unhurried afternoons, the words she'd whispered into the dark while he lay fevered found their way back into daylight between them, spoken again, this time with both of them wide awake to hear it. Silas admitted, in his own halting way, that he'd spent 6 winters convincing himself that closing his door to the world was the only way to keep from losing anyone else, and that the night Ivy knocked had terrified him more than the storm outside ever could, because some part of him already knew that opening that door meant risking everything all over again. "I opened it anyway," he said, echoing words he'd spoken weeks before, but this time there was no uncertainty behind them. "And I'd open it again, every single time, if it meant you and Nora standing on the other side." The 3 weeks came and went, and when Everett Slade rode back up the frozen drive expecting to deliver another cold formality, he found instead a farm transformed, fences mended, a barn rebuilt strong enough to weather any storm, fields cleared and ready for spring, and enough livestock secured through Silas's quiet negotiations to settle the debt in full before the deadline he'd once delivered like a verdict. Slade said little as he counted the payment, tipped his hat out of habit rather than courtesy this time, and rode away without the satisfaction he usually carried from visits like this one. Ivy watched him go from the porch, Nora's hand in hers, Silas standing close enough that his shoulder brushed against hers without either of them stepping away. Winter had nearly finished its work on the valley by then, but for the first time since her husband's death, Ivy didn't dread what the season had left to take from her, because everything that mattered most was already standing right beside her. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself hoping for Ivy and Silas the way I did while writing it, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe and stay, because somewhere out there is another story just like this one, waiting for someone who still believes second chances are worth telling.